Good morning, Nexus friends. Welcome to another Sunday morning online edition of our service here at Nexus. I hope you're having a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend, getting in some time with maybe some family and friends and enjoying the weather. I hope that for you this weekend. But thanks for being with us, giving us your time and attention as always. We appreciate it. And we are powering our way through Nexus's collective practices. And we're on week 4 of 5 of those. And this week, we're talking about our practice of hospitality and forgiveness, which we actually see as two sides of the same coin, you could say, hospitality and forgiveness. Now, back in June, I spent 4 weeks talking about forgiveness. And so I want to sort of put that side of the coin on hold and focus in on hospitality this morning. And this is what our practice says about that. We are striving to invite others into our lives, give others our trust, and be willing to be vulnerable and forgiving. We seek to be a community that both gives and receives hospitality and forgiveness. We understand that the Jesus path is traveled best with company. And so we choose to not walk alone and invite others into our own personal journeys of faith, recognizing that growth and development comes through the wisdom and guidance of others. We acknowledge this is tremendously vulnerable, and as such, our desire is to provide opportunities where relationships can develop to the point where we allow others to speak meaningfully into our lives. This must be done by invitation alone. We will encourage each other to extend this invitation, to give others our trust and risk being vulnerable to help us grow and develop. To grow, to walk the path, we must invite others in. There you have it. We want to be the type of community where we invite others in, allow them to speak into our lives. And the whole thing can sort of be summed up by that one line. Our desire here at Nexus is to provide opportunities where relationships can develop to the point where we're willing to trust, we're willing to be vulnerable, allow others to speak meaningfully into our lives. But I think what we all know is that this is something that's risky. I don't know about you, but I've had moments in my life where people have spoken into my life, and there are some experiences I can remember where that has felt inappropriate. It's felt like a violation, like something happened there. Someone spoke into my life, and it felt sort of offside. And it's like, on the other hand, there have been moments in my life where someone has spoken into my life and it's felt challenging, maybe, but also life-giving. And so there's this spectrum, you could say, when others speak into our lives. It can be something that's damaging, something that's life-giving. But what we believe here at Nexus is that in order to grow, in order to mature and develop, we need those sort of encounters. We need people who can speak into our lives. And so I think the question for us becomes, how do we become the type of person who, when we speak into other people's lives, it's a life-giving experience rather than something that feels like a violation? Because I would say the difference between those two types of experiences is often the posture of the person behind them. How hospitable is that person? And of course, when we think about hospitality, we tend to think about things like hosting, having meals, inviting people into our homes, that sort of thing. And of course, there are many dimensions to hospitality, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. But what I want to unpack for us this morning is more of, I think, what it means to be a hospitable person. How can you and I become the type of people who others want to speak into their lives? How can we develop a posture where people feel safe and trusting in being vulnerable with us? How do we become those people? How do we become hospitable people, you could say? Well, what I want to do this morning is I want to share with you two stories from Jesus, two events, experiences that I think start to unpack what it means to be a person of hospitality, have a hospitable posture to us. And what is of interest to me in both of these stories is that Jesus is not the one offering traditional hospitality. In both of these stories, he's the one being hosted. He's not the one providing a meal. He's not the one inviting others in. He has been invited to share a meal, to be with others. And so he's on the receiving end of hospitality, but in doing so, I think he showcases for us what it means to be a person who is hospitable. First story, of course, is him with Martha and Mary and their home. It unfolds this way. As they journeyed on, he entered a certain village, and a certain woman by the name of Martha received him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who, sitting also beside the Lord's feet, listened to his speech. But Martha was distracted by serving so much, and she came and said, "Lord, does it not matter to you that my sister left me all alone to serve? Tell her, therefore, that she should assist me." And in reply, the Lord said to her, "Martha, Martha, you're anxious and disturbed about many things, but there is need of one thing. For Mary has chosen the good portion, and that will not be taken away from her." Now, two things that are going to come as no surprise to us, but the first is this, as we unpack the story. First of all, we're talking about a patriarchal culture here. And so to get at some of the details, to unpack it, we have to understand that. Again, this is no surprise, but it comes with some cultural mores, you could say. The first is this. In this culture, women were not supposed to. Their role was not to sit in and learn from traveling rabbis. That was a sort of men-only thing. So Jesus and Mary are already sort of violating that more. But again, not so dissimilar to today, but there are certain cultural expectations on women of this day as well in what their role is. A, not to be sitting in with the men during teaching, but B, that they would be the ones who play host. They're in the kitchen, they're getting the meal ready, they're doing the serving. And so none of these, I'm sure, are a big surprise to us, but when Jesus allows Mary to sit at his feet to hear his teaching, this is a shockingly liberating gesture on Jesus' part. But into this mix, along comes Martha. And she is playing her part. She's playing her role. The cultural expectation of her, you could say, has now become even self-imposed. So culture has told her this is what a woman is to do, and she sort of self-imposed that on herself. And so she comes to Jesus with a complaint. Hey, I'm doing my part. I'm being the good woman. I'm playing the role of first century woman in Palestine. I'm not in with the men. I'm serving the meal. I'm hosting. Mary, on the other hand, is not. And so she complains to Jesus, and her words to me are telling. She says, "Tell her, therefore, that she should assist me." Now, this is more than just a complaint, because what she's asking Jesus to do is to see Mary through the lens of a first century woman. Martha is expecting her sister Mary to play a certain role, to fit into certain expectations of first century women. And she wants Jesus to have the same assumptions about Mary that she does. Jesus, I want you to see Mary not as a human, but as a label. I want you to see her, Jesus, as a first century woman with all of the roles and expectations that come along with that. Jesus, see her through that lens and ask her to play the role, the label well. And Jesus, for his part, he simply won't do it. Because you see, what Jesus has done here is create a space where Mary and Martha can be free from their roles and labels. They're free to just be human. And you see, this is Jesus' caution back to Martha. Martha, you're anxious. You're disturbed about many things, Martha. You're so concerned about playing your role well, playing that culturally conditioned label, that self-imposed label. You're so anxious about playing it well. And what you have forgotten, Martha, is what it means to simply be human. You see, it's as if Jesus is saying, listen, around me, Martha, you can just be. You don't have to play that role when you're around me. Jesus was a hospitable person because he simply created space, you could say, around him where people felt free to act outside of labels and expectations, either self-imposed ones or culturally mandated ones. Be free. It's a free space. Henry Nouwen says this of hospitality. Hospitality means primarily the creation of a free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. It is not to bring men and women over to our side, but to offer freedom not disturbed by dividing lines. So this summer in Victoria Park, somebody covered the Queen Victoria statue, the big statue, with red paint. And of course, this happened right around the time that we were learning about the unmarked graves of Indigenous children at residential schools. And so it was largely thought that this was an act of protest, an anti-colonial protest, although no one was quite sure what had happened. But 2 days after that event, I'm walking through Victoria Park and I realize a scene is developing. There's a man on top of that statue and he's just hanging out on top of it. He doesn't seem to be bothered. He doesn't seem to have any sort of agenda. He's just hanging out on top of it. But below him, the police are taping off a section around the statue, and there's about 7 or 8 of them surrounding the statue trying to coax this man down. Now, of course, I'm nosy, so I'm up against the yellow tape, right? What's going on? Trying to hear from people around who've been there longer than me, and nobody's quite sure what's going on. They don't know why the man's up there. They don't know why he won't come down. But as we're watching this unfold, a bigger crowd starts to gather. And of course, at this point, people start making assumptions, it would seem. Though nobody knows why he's up there, 2 camps sort of develop. The first camp are these people who believe he's up there as an act of protest, and they're going around the crowd trying to tell people about residential school history. Other people in the crowd are getting agitated by this. There's a bit of yelling back and forth between some people, but this one camp, they eventually decide to start a petition. And so they're going around getting signatures in support of letting the red paint stay on Queen Victoria. And they believe that this man on the statue is there for that cause. But there's a whole other camp in this circle, and they think the exact opposite. They believe the man went up there to clean off the paint. And so one guy's walking around with a bucket of water and soap saying he wants me to give him the soap and water so he can clean it off. And so there's these assumptions going on, but nobody's really quite sure. And the police are trying to talk him down. Then they send in a mental health worker to try to talk him down, and that's not working. Eventually, the police, they let a group of Indigenous leaders go and talk to him. They do a ceremony. He doesn't want to come down at the end of it. They let the man with the bucket go talk to him. He doesn't want to come down after that. And so there's this confusion, but also this elevated sense of unruliness happening in the crowd. Everyone's convinced he's up there as part of their side, part of their label. And so you have the police who are assuming, of course, that this is some sort of mental health case, that this man is up there as a public nuisance, and their job is to figure out how to get him down. But then you have these protesters who assume that he's up there as an anti-colonial protester. They're walking around with a petition. He's fighting for our cause. Let's get other people on board as well. And then you have the defenders of the statue, you could say. They think he's there protecting our heritage. He wants to clean off the statue, wants to wash off the paint. And here's the thing, in that moment, no one, myself included, seemed to be able to see this man on the statue as anything beyond a label. For the police, mental health, public nuisance. For protesters, that's what he was in their camp, an anti-colonial protester. For the defenders, he was there defending some sort of heritage. Clearly, he was one of those 3 things. And here's the thing, everyone had no idea why he was up there. The man wasn't talking much. He was friendly. He just kept saying, I don't want to come down. I like climbing. And eventually, okay, the situation seemed to work itself out. But I remember in reflecting on that moment, I thought, how odd. No one really knows what's going on here, but everyone has assumed a certain label on him. It's either mental health, he's a protester, or a defender. It's interesting, 2 days later, I was in the park again. Sure enough, there's the same man back on top of the statue, except this time there's nobody else around. And so I stopped to talk to him. And as I got talking to him, looking up on the statue, I was like, hey, that was kind of a big ordeal the other day. What was that about? And remember, he said to me, Everyone kept making a big deal of it. I'm a rock climber. I just wanted to climb and be up there. I had no agenda. It was fascinating to me because seeing this person there, how quick we are as humans to want to label, to bring someone into a certain camp, to put certain expectations on people. And yet this man, the human behind the labels, seemed to just want to climb. Didn't seem to be about mental health, protest, or defending, at least from what I can tell. This is, I think, what Jesus is trying to get at with his life and ministry. There's always a human behind labels and expectations, and Jesus always seems to be trying to get at this. The person behind the culturally mandated role or label or expectation, there's a human there. And Jesus was constantly trying to create space for people to be human beyond cultural expectations, beyond self-imposed roles, beyond whatever label we might want to put on them. And we see this very powerfully in the story of Zacchaeus. And having entered Jericho, he was passing through, and look, a man called by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He wished to see who Jesus is and was not able on account of the crowd because he was small of stature. And having run ahead, he climbed up into a sycamore tree so that he might see him because he was just about to pass by there. And Jesus, as he came to the place, looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, be quick, come down, for it is necessary for me to stay in your house today. And making haste, he descended and welcomed him with joy. And seeing this, everyone murmured, saying that, oh, he went into a lodge with a man who is a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half my possessions to the destitute. And if I have taken anything from anyone by falsehood, I will restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today, salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what has been lost. Oh, there's so much going on in this story. I love it. When Zacchaeus agrees to host Jesus, the crowd, right, is murmuring, oh, Jesus is dining with a sinner. They have this Zacchaeus guy pegged to a T. They've got that label on him. We know exactly who this guy is. And they aren't exactly wrong either. Zacchaeus fits under a nice, neat label. He's a tax collector, which means he was an incredible sinner in the eyes of his community. It meant that he worked very closely with the ritually unclean Romans, which made him unclean. He served their imperial colonialist purposes, you could say. It made him, in the eyes of everyone else, a collaborator with the enemy. He was a tax collector, and beyond just being in bed with the enemy, it meant that he very likely used his position to enrich himself at everyone else's expense. He's a man in a position of power and authority over these people, and he's on the wrong side. I mean, this Zacchaeus guy, he isn't getting a whole lot of invitations to dinner. But of course, he's curious. He wants to check out this Jesus guy, but there's a crowd, and we're told that he's short. He's lowly in nature, which there's more going on here, right? I don't think it's just that he's physically short. He's lowly in the eyes of the community. He's low in stature in the way people perceive him. So he goes ahead and he climbs a tree, which I think is also no accident in the story. He takes his place, you could say, above the crowd. He climbs into his role, his label as tax collector, and he perches himself above the crowd, playing the role of tax collector. He might be short in the eyes of the community, but in his tax collector role, he hangs above the crowd with his power and authority. And the first thing that Jesus does in addressing him is what? Says his name, Zacchaeus, and then asks him to come down. Oh, which I love. Come out of your perch, Zacchaeus. Come out of your role above the people and let's eat together. Jesus wants to have dinner with this man no one else wants to have dinner with. This man who is shunned and despised and lowly in the eyes of community purchases himself up above the crowd where he thinks he belongs, and Jesus comes and asks him, come down. Come down out of your perch. Come down out of your role. Let's eat together as equals. And it's fascinating to me because that act alone, it produces what? The simple act of Jesus seeing him outside of the role he played as tax collector, outside of that label, the act of Jesus addressing him by name and asking him to come down out of his role, it produces a profound transformation, a profound act of repentance, you could say, simply by being seen as human, simply by being seen as someone who is more than the label they wear. Look what happens. Zacchaeus makes a declaration. He's now going to give half of his money to those in need. And if he has taken anything from anyone by falsehood, he's going to repay them 4 times, which is an act of reparation. It's not just I'll give back. I'm going to give back with interest. I'm going to repay what I've done wrong. And in that moment, Jesus declares salvation's come to this house, which is interesting on a whole other level. It's come to his house, not just him as an individual, the whole house, and he hasn't said a prayer or anything like that, but salvation comes to his house. And notice again here how Jesus addresses him. He addresses him as son of Abraham, which is, in the Jewish context, you are a child of this covenant promise. You are a child of God. I see you, Zacchaeus, beyond who you are as a tax collector, beyond the label, beyond the expectations. I see you as human. I see you as a child of God. And in restoring his dignity that way, his humanity, this profound shift occurs in him because he's created a space for Zacchaeus to be more than a label. And that is precisely what hospitality, being a hospitable person, is all about. Now, a few weeks ago, I mentioned to you this idea of robot soft exorcism. I want to unpack that for you a little bit this morning. The idea comes from a man named David Dark. And this idea is beyond fascinating to me. I'm going to let him speak in a few minutes about this idea, but basically he's trying to come up with this metaphor for how we confront and deal with power structures and the people behind them. And so he's come up with this metaphor of robots. And generally what he's saying is this: all of the structures or positions that we sort of understand as being hurtful or harmful to people are like a robot that humans climb up into. And so if you think of the robot or a robot as, say, something like operating within the narrative of white supremacism, or a robot could be just a power position within the government, or maybe you work for a tech company like Google or Facebook and you have power over people that might be harming them. That's like the robot. And so what he says is that humans climb into this robot are humans behind the control panel, operating these systems. Without humans at the control board, these power structures, these positions, they would have no power to harm. So in his metaphors, like, how do you confront, how do you deal with these robots? And he proposes robot soft exorcism. And the idea basically is this: when you confront a position or some sort of power structure that is harming with people, how do you deal with it? Well, instead of doing direct combat with the robot, what you need to perform is a soft exorcism. Instead of challenging the robot directly, what you need to do is call up to the human inside the robot. Ask them to come down and speak to you as a human. Connect with their humanity, not the robot they're operating within. The idea is essentially the same as what we've seen in Jesus here, what it means to be a hospitable person. Instead of addressing someone's label, a group identity that they fit in, some sort of cultural expectation, instead of addressing that, we have to get to the human behind them. We have to get beyond labels and rules and expectations and speak to the human behind them. Speak to the human in the robot. Call them down. Speak to them one-on-one. And if you follow David Dark on Twitter, for any Twitter people here, he has a massive thread on this, posting videos of robot soft exorcism in action. A bunch of them are political stuff. It's fascinating to watch. All of them. He's just got a long list of how this operates. But what I wanted to do is to give him some airtime to explain to us one specific story about how this works, about how when confronted with someone, we reach to their humanity. And so I'm going to share with you a video from David Dark. In 6 minutes, he explains robot soft exorcism and how this plays out in one particular place in time. Here he is.
I have a story with which I'm going to conclude about an act of robot soft exorcism that occurred in 1960 in downtown Nashville. James Lawson, as you may know, came to Nashville after being counseled by Martin Luther King Jr. to move to Nashville to enroll at Vanderbilt Divinity and to see about being part of the integrating of the lunch counters in up till then segregated lunch counters in Nashville. You had the whites only section in a restaurant, and you had the area for the language of the time was for colored people, in the same way that you had water fountains for colored people. James Lawson, a student remotely of Gandhi, of Howard Thurman, of any number of folks, trained American Baptist Bible College students in the work of nonviolently sitting in the whites only section, demanding service, and then waiting for law enforcement to come and drag them out of the restaurant and then wait for arrest. In order to do this well, you had to be trained in role playing beforehand, and if you didn't believe that you had it in you to not lash out or hit back or say something that might incite violence to the people who are calling you any number of words, your job was to not try that day, because you could wreck the whole thing. Similarly, in Nashville right now and in Ferguson years ago, in all of these instances, you can have 1,000 nonviolent protesters, and if one person joins that crowd and throws a brick through a window, it is suddenly a riot, according to media sources. And it does give governors and mayors and whomever coverage to crack down violently on a nonviolent demonstration. So the story still headed to the exchange. James Lawson was there in 1960 to remind the students of their commitment to the teachings of Jesus specifically, and to tell the gathering white citizens of Nashville who were trying to rough them up, these students are committed to nonviolence. You might strike them, but they will not strike back, and you can deal with yourself on whether or not that's a courageous or heroic thing to punch someone who is honor-bound to not hit back. So Lawson was there to mediate, and out of this, a man with a leather jacket pushed his way to the front of the crowd and spat in James Lawson's face and called him the N-word. James Lawson looked at the man and said, as the spit was rolling down his face, and said, "Do you have a handkerchief?" The man, caught off guard, produced a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to James Lawson. And as James Lawson was wiping the spit off of his face, he noticed the guy had a leather jacket on, sort of James Dean motorcycle-y kind of thing. He saw a motorcycle behind the man and said, "Is that your motorcycle?" To which the man said, "Yes, it is." And James Lawson said, "What's the horsepower on that motorcycle?" And within a few seconds, James Lawson and the aggressor are talking about motorcycles. And within a few more seconds, the man who had spat in James Lawson's face looked around and said, "Is there any way I can help you folks with what you're doing?" It was a complete disarming, an exorcism, I want to say, that occurred in that moment. And a man who knows what his narrative was at that point in time, but within seconds he was interested in changing his narrative. And of course, as we know, repentance is metanoia, is turning your mind around. I of course want to note that there are others who tried that kind of thing and it did not work. but it did work in this one moment in which James Lawson was prepared to say something like that. I took a nonviolence class at Vanderbilt with Reverend Lawson, and I was able to ask him, how do you become someone to whom it would occur to respond that way to an angry, violent person? And he said, well, you have to keep in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility. I was so glad I was there to hear those words, because I honestly feel that it was a little like being on hand to write words down when any prophet or when Jesus himself drops on us a lyrical, eloquent aphorism with which to survive a toxic, violent terror age. So I will leave you with that. You have to keep in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility, and I give that to you as an oracle of beloved community.
What an absolutely beautiful story. And what I loved is that, of course, David Dark acknowledged that this doesn't work all the time. Sometimes it goes the other way, but in certain times and places, it does work. And what I think Jesus, David Dark are calling us to is this idea of speaking to people's humanity, not allowing ourselves to address people by labels we have on them or expectations we have on them, but creating a space, allowing them to be human and speaking to the human, not the label, not the expectation, not the role. And I love how he quotes James Lawson at the end. You have to keep in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility. What does it mean to be a hospitable person? As we consider this practice here at Nexus, that we want to be hospitable so that we can have relationships in community here where others can speak into our lives. And the reality is, I think for me, is I believe fundamentally that this is how we grow and change and develop, by others speaking meaningfully into our lives. How do we become the type of people who others want to speak into their lives? How do we become the type of people who others see as safe, who others see as life-giving? How do we become people who create space around us so that people feel free to be themselves, to be human, and not labels or caricatures or expectations of roles? How do we do that? I think it's quite simple. We do this by trying always to see the humanity behind the label. And to do that requires keeping in your mind an imagery of infinite possibility. So let us go from here and be the type of people who don't see people through labels or expectations. We see them as human, and create space for them to be free and safe and vulnerable. That, I believe, is what it means to practice hospitality, to practice being a hospitable person. Thanks, friends, for joining us this morning. I'm glad you spent part of your Thanksgiving with us. I hope you're having a fantastic weekend. For now, go in peace.